Okay. I just want to thank everyone for coming today. And last week we started having some conversations amongst Watershed Council folks about like what's going on with ODF lands and the Habitat Conservation Plan initiative. And Denise is on that, was part of the conversation. And she said, oh, well, I have information and I can share. And I said, well, how about we open it up to a conversation with not just like two of the watershed councils that were expressing specific interest, but to anyone that wants to know more, because this is really important. And Denise is the chair of the Department of State Forests Advisory Committee. She's also the executive director of the Columbia River Estuary Study Task Force. And previously, she was the director of the Tillamook Bay Watershed Council. So Denise really has a very broad set of experiences that help her to understand what we are all doing out on the land. And really appreciate your time today, Denise. And like I said, I gave you screen sharing ability, and I'm going to hand it over to you now. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Terry. I want to thank everyone who's here today. I love that the distribution kind of is like across Oregon. Um, so what we're going to focus on primarily, I just want to orient everyone, is we're going to primarily be talking about the state forests in Oregon. And there can be a lot of confusion because when you talk about forests and you look across the Oregon landscape, there's all this forest, but I think often there's not an understanding that forest is divided. I mean, we understand that there's private timber industry, right? And then we say, well, then there's state forests, and those two things can get commingled. But there's specific forests, primarily on the western side of the state, that are owned by the state of Oregon and that are managed by the Oregon Department of Forestry. And so I'm just going to share a map so we can get um, oriented to what I'm going to primarily be talking about. Okay, can everyone see the map? Yeah.
Yes,
Okay.
we can now.
Excellent. All right. So I'm going to back out a little bit and then I'll go back in. So map of Oregon, and what we're going to be talking about today is particularly the state forest lands, and those are in light blue. So a really large chunk of those are up here in the northwest corner of the state. And so they're called districts. And so there's the Northwest Oregon District. There's the South Oregon District, which is down here. And then, well, there's the Southwest Oregon District. And then there's areas, sorry. So there's districts and then and areas. Districts are like the Clatsop Forest, is like the Clatsop District. There's the Tillamook, there's the North Cascade, there's the West Oregon. These state forests are the ones that I have the most information about. There's very small state forests down in Klamath, the Sun Pass and the Gilchrist. Those have not been, I haven't spent a lot of time, and I'm going to explain why in a minute. So I don't have a lot of information about these. One of them is newer. And then we have the Southwest Oregon area. And what I'm going to focus on is some general information about ODF in general, and then I'm going to talk about state forests specifically. So, a couple of things to keep in mind. Terry reached out to me last week and said, hey, there's this private forest accords. Is this related to the HCP on Oregon State Forest? What's going on? And this is exactly what I was talking about in terms of this commingling of all these things. The private forest accords are separate from state forest lands. And so it's really interesting that there's a lot of things happening around state forests at the same time, but you can think about them being in different buckets. And so I'm just going to talk about the private forest accords really quick, and then we're going to set that aside. So back like in 2018, 2019, and even long before that, there's been this pressure on Oregon Department of Forestry to upgrade their standards for private forest lands. And it got to the point where the environmental community was like, no one is listening to us. And so they threatened and were actively working on bringing a ballot measure forward that would dramatically impact operations on private forest lands because they were like, no one will listen to what we're saying. The state had already gotten in trouble for not following federal standards, particularly around buffers for riparian areas and things like that. The federal government had taken away funding because we weren't meeting these water quality standards around federal buffers. And so the environmental community kept pushing and then finally said, well, we're just going to put a ballot measure on the ballot and we're going to let the people of Oregon decide. And at that point, the private timber industry stepped forward and said, okay, we're willing to negotiate. And so they spent, I think, at least 2 years working together to develop the private forest accord. And there was some legislation passed in, I believe it was 2021, and that was directing them to do this. And then there was legislation that is built on these accords. And one of the pieces of this is another Habitat Conservation Plan, or HCP. So this is why it can be confusing, because ODF is moving forward with a Habitat Conservation Plan for forest lands. There's also an HCP moving forward for private forest lands, particularly for aquatic species on private forests. And the reason for both HCPs is to provide some surety and some consistency over time for operations. So we can just set the private forests accords aside because that's completely separate from Oregon state forests. So before I move on, I want to make sure that that's clear to folks, and that if you have any questions, please ask. I will say this is all really complicated. I'm the chair of the State Forest Advisory Committee. It's a group of stakeholders. It actually functions in many ways like a watershed council. So you have lots of people with lots of different perspectives about how the state forests of Oregon should be operated and managed. And we come together about 3 or 4 times a year and provide feedback and advice to Oregon Department of Forestry staff. We do not talk about policy. We speak to implementation of their policies. So we review their annual operations plans. We review their implementation plans, which are traditionally 10-year documents. Right now, they're shorter than that. And we provide feedback on what they're doing on the ground. And so I just will say today's going to be this little snippet of information for you all. But the learning curve in terms of learning about ODF is kind of like the work that we do, where the learning curves are really steep. And the same is with all of these ODF pieces. There's so many pieces that work together on this puzzle of forests in Oregon. We're going to be talking about just a little piece of that. It doesn't look like there's any questions on the private forest accords. So now we will move into state forests. As I said before, State Forest Advisory Committee has been focused on the Northwest Oregon area, right? So that's like Clatsop County, Tillamook County, Western Lane, Santiam. Those are some of the main state forests that I have heard about several times a year, every year since 2009. And as a stakeholder, I was originally appointed to the committee as the Watershed Council / Conservation Liaison, and I've continued to serve in that role. I've been serving as chair for a couple of years now, though. So let's talk about the Northwest Oregon area a little bit. So you have this, like, how did the state end up with 640,000 acres west of the Cascades in state hands? How did that happen? What happened was back in the early 1900s, there was private timber industry went in, logged the lands, and then said, well, now there's no more trees. Like, we can't pay taxes on this land. We like it. They were basically like, it's worthless. We don't want to pay taxes. So the counties kept getting all of this land because people were not paying the companies were not paying their taxes. And over time, then they just handed that land over to the state. And then there was the Tillamook burn, and those lands were handed over to the state, which is part of the reason why in Tillamook and Clatsop, those are the two largest state forests in the state. And there was an agreement made that the counties would hand these lands over to the state for management. The state would manage them. The department, what became the Oregon Department of Forestry, would keep 33% of whatever profits were made on the management of those lands, and 66% would go to the counties. And so what this has done is for many rural counties on the western side of the state in particular, and particularly in the far northwest corner, so Clatsop County, Tillamook, but it impacts all of these counties that have this forest land. Large portions of their budget are made up by this timber revenue from ODF, and they rely on it really heavily. But starting in about 2008, with the recession of 2008, timber prices just took this dive. And ever since then, ODF is supposed to fully fund itself with its operations. It's supposed to stand on its own financially. But they have consistently been heading towards the red since about 2008, 2009. They've done a lot of things to create more efficiency within the operation, within their department. In 2009, they had really massive layoffs. They've restructured their entire organizational chart. So they've done a lot of things to become more efficient. But that line, that curve, to go back into profitability just has never swung back in the other direction. And so one of the reasons why they moved forward with the HCP, because they tried to do an HCP in the 1990s, and they couldn't come to any agreement with the agencies. So the agencies would be U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and NOAA in particular. And so it all fell apart. And so whenever you knew that they were going to be operating in places where there would be northern spotted owls, and now they're looking at marbled murrelets, they're spending millions of dollars to go out and do surveys of whether or not those threatened or endangered species are located in these areas where they want to do operations and cut down trees. And they thought, well, if we could get a habitat conservation plan, we would have surety. The habitat conservation plan that they're currently negotiating is going to go out 70 years. So they'll have a lot of surety around what they can do in terms of operations over this long time scale. And they won't be having to spend these funds for all of these surveys every year. And so, I think they see this as a way to continue to promote efficiency within the department, because there will be a foundation that they can build on in terms of federal regulations around threatened T&E species. So all that to say, you can imagine like just the complications with these pieces. So they started working on the HCP, maybe 2020, 2021. It was a while ago. And I think they thought they were going to be able to wrap it up in a couple years. It's taking a lot longer. And Zach, you're the one who wrote the email and said, hey, I need to be able to work with ODF. They won't work with me because of the HCP. Can we speed this up? And, my response was no. We could try to put pressure, but it's not going to work right now. Like we need to figure out some other ways to get these questions that you have answered. Um, because the HCP is also going to change their founding like management document, which is called the Forest Management Plan. And so what you have within the department right now is they're doing massive amount of work on what's going to be kind of their foundational documents, which will be a brand new forest management plan. And the forest management plan that they're using right now came about in the early 1990s, when all of the lawsuits occurred over the northern spotted owl, and they had to rethink how they were operating, and they had to figure out where all the owl circles were, and they started having to do all of these surveys, right? And now they're going to have a new HCP with a lot of new requirements around operations, and so they have to align the HCP and the FMP so they work together. So, and these are massive documents with lots and lots of details. And so they've been working on both of them now for years. They are looking to begin having them both approved and utilizing them both. 2027, 2028 is what we're looking at in terms of a timeline. And right now, they're moving forward with the HCP and they're moving forward with work on the FMP. And just kind of going to the Board of Forestry with updates over time and help and getting their decisions on different pieces and moving them forward. There's challenges, right? Because the HCP and new FMP are going to impact the finances because of the way that the forest is going to be managed. There's the modeling is showing that they're not going to be able to log as much as they do right now. And so counties are very concerned and upset about this. And so they've had to spend some time working through those concerns with the counties. The other piece is they have to align this with what is, I would call, the department's North Star, which is called greatest permanent value. And it's defined as healthy, productive, and sustainable forest ecosystems that over time and across the landscape provide a full range of social, economic, and environmental benefits to the people of Oregon. So you can imagine they are not working to maximize profit and not pay attention to the other aspects of the values that the state forests bring to the state, including a lot of environmental value and also a lot of recreational value. And what we've seen over the last 5 years is a big increase in the use of the state forests for recreational purposes. And so, as someone who's been engaged in conversations with ODF for a long time and has watched their management, what I've come to see is it's very similar to what any of us grapple with, I think, in our jobs. But for them, I think it because of the funding to the counties and kind of the political fights that can happen over state forests because of the way the funding is structured, they walk a line that is incredibly narrow and really difficult to maneuver within. And so their job is really, really challenging. I'll just say that. I will also say that from my experience, the state forests staff are so proud of the work that they do. And all of us as Oregonians, I think, should be really thankful for the work that they do. They really do try to figure out the best way to move things forward in what can be really difficult situations sometimes. And so the other thing to keep in mind about these really long timelines is last summer, many of the state forest's employees were deployed on fires for over 60 days across the summer, which meant that their colleagues who stayed back in the ODF offices, their workloads just expanded dramatically. And then when everyone got back in mid to late October, they were a quarter behind on their workload. When we met a couple weeks ago, they were only 2 weeks behind on their workload. But that kind of heavy lift year after year after year is very difficult on staff and is a really good way to burn people out. And so just keep in mind in all of what I'm trying to give you is the level of complexity that I see when I look at the department and when I look at these issues. I think there's a desire sometimes when we talk about natural resources and environmental issues and social issues to try to narrow them and to make them really black and white. And from my perspective, natural resource management, particularly of public resources, is just multiple layers of gray. And that's what I see when I look at ODF. So the other thing to keep in mind about ODF is they also need to have a level of operations and of logging that is consistent over time because they provide a lot of logs to the local mills in our rural areas. These mills are dependent on state forest timber because we don't export any state forest logs. They are all processed within Oregon. So as the department is thinking about their operations, they also have to think about making sure that they are providing a consistent basis of operations so that the timber industry economy is able to continue to function because private timber industry isn't, there are timber companies that own forests and mills, and so they're thinking about this as well, but many don't. And so for across the landscape, you can also think about ODF as being an economic driver for these mills and for, the loggers and, the log truck drivers and all the folks who work in the timber industry in Oregon. And so they play a massive role in that industry as well on the economic side. So you can see like all these economic pieces, and then you have these social pieces, and then you have these environmental pieces, and it can be very, very difficult to balance them all in a way that that they never make everybody happy ever. So I think with that, I will say, so the thing to keep in mind about the HCP, 70 years, and is going to provide kind of a base of operations for them. They will be able to have take, they won't have to do surveys. And so they're looking at this as another way to create more efficiency within the department in order to help them move that curve back towards the black. I think everybody is starting to come to the conclusion, though, that the split of like the 66% to the counties and the 33% to ODF is not working well right now. And ODF is just continuing to try to figure out how to get more and more efficient in order to continue to make that work. And so that's why we're where we're at right now, is just this drive for some surety, for more efficiency, and to kind of look to what the state forests are going to be at least for the next 70 years. And so taking this long range perspective, I think is it's been a stretch for the department to do, but I also think that I think it's been a good process to kind of just take a step back and be like, we're going to redo these pieces and see what happens. So I will stop there. Happy to answer questions. I'm not an ODF employee. I'm not involved in the day-to-day operations of it. So there may be things I cannot answer. If I can't, I will find the answer and come back to you. And then if there's messages that you want me to take back to ODF staff or to the State Forest Advisory Committee, I'm planning to tell them that we've all met and planning to say, hey, this is what I'm hearing from folks involved in watershed, soil and water conservation, and land trusts. And so I'm happy that's part of my role. And so I'm really happy to do that as well. So Zach, I see your hand is raised.
Of course it is, right? Um, so thank you so much because that was a really great summary of ODF's history and how we got to where we are today with the HCP and with the private forest accords and all these different pieces. Um, what I'm so part of the reason for that email I sent out to the network collection, right? A big piece of it was this sense of uncertainty about some of the federal regulatory environment and partnerships that we've all had, including um, just not knowing where that stood between, for instance, ODF and NOAA and U.S. Fish and Wildlife and the progress of developing the HCP and this thing that people have been working so diligently on for so long now. Um, with everything else that has been disrupted, I've I've had some concerns both in, boy, I'm really ready for this thing to happen so we can start getting back to work, and also, is it still going to happen? And so it's sounding right now from your perspective that everything is still on track, even though we are looking at a 2027 to 2028 completion date.
Yes. So
Okay.
at the meeting earlier this month, the question came up of what's happening at the services, right? At NOAA and at US Fish and Wildlife Service. Do they feel like they are going to be able to meet the deadlines, the schedule for completing the HCP? I'm just speaking to the State Forest HCP at this point. And they said yes. The federal agencies did get back to ODF, and so what ODF told us is the schedule is not shifting. Like their timeline for the next 2 years is in place, and they're moving on it. They're not slowing down. Everything's just kind of moving forward, full steam ahead, with the understanding from the services themselves that they are not planning to slow this down at all.
That's great news. I'm really glad to hear that because that's been a question that has been looming kind of large. You were showing that map of where state forests were at, and I was sitting here thinking, yeah, I work in Tillamook and Clatsop State Forests because my whole watershed has a huge amount of state forest land, and I actually wonder if we're proportionally the watershed council with the most state forest in it potentially, but that's a whole different thought. Um,
I can just say, so the Tillamook Bay Watershed Council,
ah,
89%, 89%
okay,
of their watershed is in state forest hands.
they've got us beat. We're something like 40 or 50 something percent. Um, so my follow-up to that is getting into kind of the nitty-gritty because as we try and apply for some of these final offerings that came out of things like the bipartisan infrastructure law and other federal funding sources like that, we're trying to plan for work over the next 3, 6, 8, 10 years, right? Um, and the piece that's kind of in the nitty gritty that I'm not getting good answers on about the HCP is how the interaction's going to work out between federal funding that goes into habitat restoration and the metrics that ODF is going to be required to meet their requirements for restoration. And kind of a corollary to that that's in the conversation for me is this question of, because so much restoration happens driven by federal dollars, um, how is that like restoration work that ODF needs to do that may be restricted from using federal dollars going to continue to be able to move forward, if federal monies make it ineligible to count towards the HCP restoration goals? Does that make sense as a question? I just want to make sure I'm being clear with it. And I haven't read any drafts recently, and so it's not like I actually have looked at those details of what the goals are or anything like that, right? So yeah, I think that's my question.
Yeah, it's one I actually plan to take back to ODF staff as like the Watershed Council liaison, or kind of a liaison to natural resource entities that do this work, and entities that want to work in state forest on state forests, and can bring not just OWEB dollars, but can bring federal funding forward. And so I think they need to get some clarity around this with the services. Both for themselves, but also for entities like yours and other watershed councils, or soil and water conservation districts, or anyone who's interested in working on forestry land and interested in bringing federal dollars to the table to do this work, and make sure that that ODF will be able to utilize those projects as counting towards their restoration activities as part of the HCP, so they're not excluded just because there's some piece of federal money in the pot, because most of these projects are a mix of funding. And so, I will have a conversation with ODF staff around this and see if they may not be able to give us clarity, but I'm going to ask them to just let them know two things. One, that the really long process is precluding like the pipelines of work, like for your watershed council. And I'm sure there may be others as well. And that keeping those pipelines filled with projects that can actually hit the ground is really important. I know for Crest, and when I was with the Tillamook Bay, like this is how we function. This is how we like keep staff employed and move things forward, right? And so helping them to understand, because they're not thinking, I can guarantee you they're so focused on kind of what they're focused on that they're not thinking about this. So help them to understand that, and then to get some clarity from them, or just simply to say, would you ask the services this question, and let them know that there are stakeholders that are interested in helping with the restoration work across the landscape, who want to be able that we can include federal funding in the financial piece of these projects. And so, Zach, that's already on, like, that's after I read your emails, I was like, I need to just go ask this. So I will ask this question and get back to all of you about what I find out.
A program associate, yeah.
All right.
I really appreciate that.
Yeah, you're welcome, Zach. Happy to do it. Other questions, comments, discussion?
I do have more.
Let's see if anyone else has got anything, Zach, and then
Yeah,
we
totally.
can definitely keep going. But I just want to make sure if anybody else has comments or questions that we allow for those.
Hi, Denise. Quick question. I know ODF has at least published or has out there the designated habitat conservation areas within the HCPs. But I'm curious, and apologies for not being more informed, but I'm curious about if those HCAs are subject for being moved or changed within the next few years as the process finalizes, or are those kind of more or less set in stone? And it's more from the lens from, a land trust where we're looking at connectivity as part of our metrics on conserving land. So if we're confident that, neighboring lands are likely going to be in these HCAs, that we can kind of plan accordingly.
Yeah, that's a good question, Mark. I can particularly make sense for land trusts who are looking at this. Um, so what I know, and I'll bring this question to ODF staff as well. So here's what ODF is what I've heard from ODF. So I'm gonna get in the weeds just for a minute. In the current FMP, the one that's been in place now for several decades, they have like these different names for different types of stands. And so they would grow like older forest structure, which we would think of like older forests, right? And so there were certain places across the landscape where they wanted to grow forests that were older. And all of these structures that were in the FMP are shifting as we're moving to the HCPs, the HCP. And the HCP, their habitat conservation areas are set around places where they've surveyed and found more like northern spotted owls, marbled murrelets. And so they're developing these habitat conservation areas both for terrestrial and aquatic species. Based on places where they know that they already are, and so they want to protect that habitat more. But what they're finding as they're setting them in place is that I think across the state forest, but I think particularly like in Clatsop and in the Tillamook, is that those conservation areas are moving to the interior of those state forests rather than being more along the edges. And so for land trusts, that's something that I think to think about in terms of where these conservation areas where there's going to be more protections are going to be they're going to be more centered within the forest, the state forests themselves. So one thing that has come up at the State Forest Advisory Committee now multiple times is that ODF is going to be do logging around the edges more, at the outsides of their state forests, which is going to impact landowners of all types, whether it's land trusts or it's someone with a house. And so they're getting a lot more questions about this because people who've had a house for a long time and that state forest that was adjacent to them hasn't been logged in decades, it's more than likely going to be on the list of being logged because they're having to move their operations around. So that's not a direct answer to your question, Mark. I realize that. And I will go to ODF because I can't say that it is fully set in stone, but I will say that based on what I've heard from ODF staff, they have a good sense of where those habitat conservation areas are going to be. And they're actively planning for them to stay in place because they're actively trying to figure out how to do the outreach and the work that they're going to need to do as they're shifting where they're doing operations to places that were maybe older forest stands in the past that are more to the outskirts of that state forest. And they're going to go in and do operations in there. And people will there will more than likely be some pushback in one way or another. They understand that. They understand why that will happen. So I wouldn't say set in stone, but I would say that they have a pretty clear idea of where those locations are and what they're going to be. But I'll double check with them about how much and if they are moving around, my sense is that they're not going to move them. It's not going to be big movements, like big swings across the landscape now. They're going to probably be smaller refinements, but I will double check on this for you. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would think, this is Terry, just that, like with regard to land trusts that are looking to purchase land and create connectivity, that, a shift to logging on the perimeter of the properties could really interrupt the potential for connectivity between, the forest land and then potential adjacent property that a land trust wants to purchase and preserve. So I wonder how much um, uh, space there is for negotiation or like conversations or agreements between ODF and the land trust. If a land trust were to be in a position to purchase a neighboring property, could that impact whether or not ODF decides to log along the perimeter of their land? And I don't, yeah, so I really don't know how those decisions are, like, once they're made, are they completely, is it static at that point? Or is there some room for negotiation should an opportunity arise with like a land trust, for example, and to, create more habitat and preserve more land? So I'm not in the world of land trusts, but I care about habitat connectivity. And so I can just imagine that that might be something that would be important to know if the final plans are, set in stone and static, or is there some negotiation space, like 10 years down the road or something, after the plans have been adopted. So, but
Yeah, it's a good point, Terry. And it brings to mind some things to think about. One is for land trusts who either own forest property that's adjacent to ODF or are looking to purchase forest property that's going to be adjacent to ODF. Meet with ODF and talk with them about what's coming so you have a sense of that. And also talk with them while they're still in this phase that they're in. If the way that a land trust is planning to manage their land can help ODF. Now, ODF, I think in the HCP, they're only going to be able to get value for like the lands that they're managing, right? But if there's ways to think about values across the landscape, it could be another question to bring to the services, particularly if it's larger acreages. I don't know what the answer would be, but now I'm curious, like how that would play out. And then you were asking about things set in stone. So the way to think about the HCP and the FMP is these are really like higher level documents, right? So like 30,000 foot elevation looking across like hundreds of thousands of acres, right? But the actual operations each year are laid out in what's called the annual operations plans, and like the ones for 20, fiscal year 25, 26, those are out for public comment right now. So you can go into the document and find out where they're planning to lay out their sales. And
I
if you
see.
have comments about locations, you can tell them that. And then every 10 years, they do what's called an implementation plan, which lays out their plan for the 10 years. And then those annual operations plans are like linked back to that, right? And so they're in the process of redoing implementation plans right now for the next, or they're taking implementation plans that they put together 2 years ago, and they're updating because they were only supposed to last for 2 years because the hope was that we would have the new FMP HCP either like this year. Like the hope was that it would begin on July 1 of 2025.
I see.
So they're doing a revision to those IPs in order to push them out another 2 years. So public comment is going to be available for those as well, coming up here, I think, in the next couple months. And you can sign up on ODF's website to be notified about these. And so if you want to make public comment, you absolutely can.
Thank you. And I think Zach had his hand up, and then although as we probably need to wrap up in like the next 5 minutes or so. But we have 5 minutes, so like, go ahead. Unless someone else has a question, but I know Zach is really impacted by this, and thank you, Zach, for asking the question, and Denise for hopping in so that we could have a more robust and shared conversation. I think this is great. So yeah, Zach.
Yeah, Zach.
So, my final question is, again, because we have so much state forest area, all of our restoration projects currently run through that are on state land, well, state Oregon Department of Forestry land. There we go, to be specific. They all run through Eric Moberly, who is the aquatic riparian specialist for ODF, right? And Eric is, I think, the only person in that position for the entire state.
Mm.
Which, when he first started, for instance, and like the man is overworked, just to be really clear. I'm not complaining about Eric at all. But like when he first started, we all gave him like a nice big list of descriptions of projects we'd like to go through, right? And do. So we could start scheduling things and get them involved in the AOPs and all that sort of thing. Or aligned with the AOPs, rather, timing wise. And because he's the only person in that position, a lot of them he hasn't even looked at yet, is my understanding from him, right? And so it sits me in this place of, I know that ODF has been working so hard for so long to streamline and create efficiency and had the big layoffs back in 09. But what it really seems like to me is we need another Eric, especially if the state forests are going to have restoration metrics to be meeting. They're never going to meet those with just Eric in play because he just can't be everywhere in the state. It takes him 5 hours to get to the Nehalem, which is half a workday, you know? And so I wonder if there's any talk in amongst planning around the rollout of the HCP, which I know is a couple of years away, about having somebody else working alongside Eric in this aquatic riparian specialist role so that there is enough just person available to serve around the state. Because boy, I want Eric to have some help. He's such a good guy and he works so hard and like just does not have enough time.
I'll bring that question to ODF staff as well and see I'll let you know when I hear back.
I mean, we're even open to, and I would probably need to talk to the other councils and other organizations that partner with ODF in the area. But the idea has been floated of, what if we find a grant somewhere to support ODF having somebody like to help Eric? Because I know the budget is so tight over there that it's unlikely to come from there. But what if an outside group were to put together, a proposal to be like, hey, listen, this is a major bottleneck. Please give us X number of dollars so that we can give it to ODF so they can have a second person. Like, it's important enough that I know a lot of people would put in the legwork to help make it happen.
So, that's happened. I can think of one entity that did that, with DEQ and Tillamook, right? Splits their time.
Yep, totally.
And so, I think it's a great idea, Zach. I'll float it and see if I can get at least a nod of we'd be open to talking about it. But it's funny because that was the same place my mind went as you were talking about it. So it's at least worth a conversation, right?
I really think it is. And, if there's something most of the people in this room here are probably good at, it's writing grants and finding funding. And so I feel like we could probably piece something together to get that support in place, And I think it's a really important piece of that puzzle for them to be able to roll out the HCP and hit those restoration goals because they're kind of ambitious, which is great. I love ambition. So, yeah.
I would
Thank you.
Zach, I would add to this, Zach and Denise, that if this is a particular position that really needs to be expanded to 2 FTE, for example, that's a place where it can be asked in the budget as well through the budget process. for ODF. I mean, I really appreciate that there would be watershed councils willing to try to identify grant funding, but you know, it could be a pop or something as part of the budget maybe. And uh I know budgets are really tight, but if this is a particular area where there's a bottleneck in getting work done on the ground, that partner organizations like watershed councils and stormwater conservations, districts, they can do the work, but they need ODF to like process and approve and all that. Then it's like, okay, we've got funding and organizations that can do the stuff, right? But we need ODF to step up and have one more or 0.5 or 1 FTE more. I think that to me, that's a reasonable idea to elevate at the budget process. It's probably too late this year, but maybe it's not. But anyways, just something, Denise, to consider when you're speaking with your colleagues.
Yeah, ODF has put forward POPs now
Yeah,
in several legislative sessions, and there's just this idea that they can fully fund themselves with with the 33%, and that
yeah,
they don't need any general funding. And what the department has been trying to make clear is that the structure is no longer functioning. But as someone who's like a couple steps removed, it's just really hard to
yeah.
help people and legislators and even, like entities like watershed councils and those of us who support ODF and say, yeah, a pop would be awesome. But they're going to need some help, I think, in order to make that happen. They're really going to need people to come forward and support them in it.
Which we
Yeah,
can. Like we
yeah, and
can
so
do
it's
that,
something to maybe talk about going forward because if watershed councils came together and soil and water conservation districts and land trusts and said, you know, this is a pop that we really support, we really think the department needs, and we go to our legislators and say, please support this. Um, ODF staff would be so grateful. Like, I can't tell you, because I think it's really hard for them to keep putting forward these pops and just consistently, they don't get any traction at all. I think it's really frustrating for them. So, if there's a way where we could help with that and have some general funds support this work, so that would help watershed councils and others move forward restoration work on forestry land, on, state forest lands. It would be, it's such an excellent use of funding with so much value for it. So,
yeah. And
Mhm.
like basically match when you consider how much or is coming back. So I'm hosting another Zoom meeting at 12 and it's 11:59. So I want to thank everyone for coming. Denise, this has been great. And thank you all for being here and asking the questions and participating. And Alex says, thank you all, very informative. So thank you, Alex.
and
And
I'll just say really quickly, if anyone wants to reach out to me directly, you can. Like if you have additional questions or anything, feel free to email me or give me a call. Um, like really, I'm happy to talk about this one-on-one if anyone wants to do that. I just wanted to put that out there as well.
we really appreciate your service I mean, you have your full-time job, but then you're also on this, committee and doing this today. And, it's fantastic when we have folks like you that are willing to put in the extra time and to be able to bring all the ideas together. So thank you so much. And if anyone needs Denise's contact information, I'm happy and you don't have it, you can just ask me or ask Andrea to get to me and we'll get you connected. So thank you very much, everyone. Goodbye.
Thank
Thank you.